Good morning, everyone. It is Wednesday, March 4th, 2020, 11 a.m. Welcome to the 411, an all-girl podcast that's fun but yet still informative. I'm Destiny, your host, and here I have with me Antonia Bashir, Lillian Gonzalez, and Aaliyah Scantleberry.
Okay, so I wanted to discuss a document regarding segregation that I found pretty interesting. It's from a collection called the Rosa Parks Papers, and it contains various publications from her works from 1955 up until 2000. Now, we all know Rosa Parks was a very important figure in the civil rights movement. But for those who don't know, she was villaged enough to give up her seat to a white passenger on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, this happened in 1955 when segregation was very prominent, so this obviously resulted in a lot of controversy and her arrest. There's a particular section in the document I wanted to touch on. It's regarding the Alabama Council. The Alabama Council was an organization based in Alabama that sought for the integration of blacks and whites at the time of segregation. I'm now going to read you their statement of purpose. We recognize that all men are created equal under God. Interpreted into the life of our nation, this means that each individual is endowed with the right of equal opportunity to contribute and to share in the life of our nation. No individual or group of individuals has the privilege to limit this right in any way. Therefore, we seek to attain through research and action equal opportunities for all people of Alabama. Now, the reason I found this interesting was because there seemed to be an influence of the era of enlightenment in this statement. The Declaration of Independence also had this influence, and we all know that the Declaration was a document pushing for American freedom apart from the British. The connection here is that it seems whenever there's an issue that involves more than one group of Americans, this language suggesting that all men are equal and we're stronger together seems to arise. I think it's worth noting because, again, this language was used in the Declaration during the Civil Rights Movement, the most famous example being Martin Luther King's I Had a Dream speech, and even more recently in 9/11. It didn't seem to matter who was what race during the 9/11 attacks because we were all affected in some way. So it's interesting that the country seems to still be affected by racial prejudices, similar to the times of segregation, but when there's a common issue between all of us, this "we are one" language is spoken up again.
Okay, so my first set of information is going to come from Gabriel Kornblow and an article entitled Separate but Still Unequal, Challenging School Segregation in New York City. The focal point of this article includes the challenges of racial and socioeconomic integration in New York City public schools. Other topics discussed consist of the relationship between residential and school segregation, the U.S. Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education, Washington v. Davis, and the enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Next, we go to Noli Brazil and his article entitled Large-Scale Urban Riots and Residential Segregation, a case study of the 1960s riots. In this article, Brazil takes the 1960s riots and investigates them in order to find the trends in black residential segregation levels following large-scale riot activity in 7 major U.S. cities. He found out that levels of black segregation rose in 1970 for 4 out of the 7 cities, but the increase disappeared in the 1980s and 1990s, except for in Detroit. Also, suburban neighborhoods in affected areas experienced larger and longer term increases in segregation, specifically in traditionally hyper-segregated cities in the Midwest and Northeast. Lastly, we move to Ms. Marie Noflagova and her paper entitled Racial Identities Revised, Revisited, Toni Morrison's Recitative. This paper takes a look at the way that Toni Morrison explores through the friendship of two women of a different race, and the idea that the centrality of racial identity to one's personal identity is questionable, as there are no objective foundations for drawing the color line. Morrison's short story resonates with the thought of Anthony Appiah, who considers racial identity to be one of many identities many assumes in life. An idea which was explored particularly by African American writers of the 1980s and their followers, who opened up the seemingly homogeneous identity of African Americans to plurality of their experience, thus placing it under close observation.
All right. In my research, I focused in on the quantitative impact of how race affects us in the education system. I took a deep dive into more recent accounts of modern-day racism and discovered how race affects privilege, opportunity, and how it affects people's perception of others. One of the more prominent studies I took into account, the gerrymandering of school attendance zones and the segregation of public schools, a geospatial analysis. Author and Professor Meredith P. Richards conducted a study measuring the impact of school attendance zone gerrymandering and how it affects the racial segregation of schools. Richards gathered data using a large national sample of over 15,000 attendance zones in over 600 elementary school districts nationwide. Out of all the things that she confirmed within the study, the thing that remains the most significant to me would have to be that she ultimately concluded that, quote, attendance zones of schools established since 1991 are substantially more gerrymandered than those of schools established earlier, suggesting that their attendance zone gerrymandering may be worsening over time, end quote. This is especially true for places with a denser Black population, most notably Detroit, Michigan.
Okay, guys, so that's going to be the end of our podcast for today. We would like to thank each and every one of you for listening and for allowing us to be able to pour valuable information into you guys. We love you all so much, and we will catch you in our next podcast. Peace.